Thank you, everyone. Now let me introduce our speakers. We have Josh Rame, who goes by he, him. He's a Spring member and he's from the UK. We have Carlie Macfie, who goes by she, her, and she's a Spring member who is a film editor. Before I hand it over to the speakers, I'll just explain how the meeting will work. The speakers will go first for a total of 30 minutes. Then we will have questions and comments from the audience. The speakers will respond to your questions and comments at the end in their concluding remarks. If you'd like to speak, please raise your hand and I'll add your name to the speakers list. I'll be using an equity speakers list, which means I may not call on you in the sequence you raise your hands, but will prioritize Indigenous, Black, comrades of color, women, and first-time speakers. Questions and comments are welcome, but please try to keep your contribution to 3 minutes. This will allow for more contributions during the discussion. Finally, we encourage you to post to social media through the conference to share your thoughts and experiences. Please use the hashtag RedOctober2025. You can tag Spring on all platforms using SpringMag.ca. Okay, over to the speakers.
Hello, I'm Josh. I'm going to be starting off the talk today. So AI, what is it and why do we all hate it? I'm going to start off by setting the scene a little bit and talking about ChatGPT, basically, at first. And I'll pass over to Carlie in a bit, who's going to talk about some of the issues more in depth, plus what can we do about it? AI. What I want to do is kind of separate out some terms firstly. So I want to separate out the idea of AI as a field of creating artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence, digitization of intelligence from large language models, which is your ChatGPTs and whatnot, which have gained so much attention recently. Large language models, what are they? They've become really big, and I think this is, as we all know, I think this is mainly because it's a form of, whereas automation's often affected like kind of blue-collar workers back in the past, this is a really significant development in the automation of white-collar work, which is why it's gained so much attention recently and is causing a lot of fear. So, and the investment in that AI over the last 5 years or so has started to reach like kind of crazy levels. And the sell from these people, from economists, is that AI could create kind of efficiency gains in multiple areas that can kind of boost a sagging economy and boost productivity. Or in the case of utopian tech bros, it's gonna like actually liberate humanity from work by creating like digital slaves, basically, right? So, if it's all great, why the anxiety? Why do most people feel anxiety? Right? There's a few, right? There's a few reasons in there. There's job losses, environmental damage, hidden exploitation of labor, and the proliferation of slop, which we're going to talk about all of those things today. But first, we need to get a grip on what LLMs are exactly. So as I've said, AI is a broad field, and there's been a bunch of technological developments leading up to the development of ChatGPT and large language models. But the modern era really started in 2017, and in 2017, researchers kind of came up with this thing called the transformer model. And that was developed actually by people working on translation software. As a lot of you know who speak 2 languages, one-to-one translation doesn't work. You need a mechanism to give context to the translation. So they developed some software to do this, and they created this thing called the attention mechanism, or generative pre-trained transformer, which is where the term GPT comes from. And they found like very quickly that actually when you were using this, if you use the transformer but kind of ignore the translation element, it actually spits up a lot of like plausible human sounding text. And they were like, oh, this could be quite useful. And it's from this they coined the term large language model, and this has really dominated the story of AI today. So large language models are basically, and then we'll get started on the problems now. What they're doing is they're using statistics to sort through these giant data sets and emit text, comprehensible sentences. Now there's a lot of inputs which make the production of that text possible. The first one, as you've probably guessed, is data. About 8 billion pages of the internet have been used to train these things, right? And while it's not the whole internet, they're fed a huge chunk of training data. And that text is then used to generate a product to consume. So the first issue we have here is plagiarism, right? I'm sure you're all aware of these lawsuits going on from authors against Anthropic that have been successful. I think Anthropic are paying out, what have I written here, 1.5 billion to authors whose work they plagiarized. And I think in a very common sense way, we know that these things are plagiarizing real human labor. And I think that's the first thing we should get our heads around as socialists is this isn't a thinking thing. It's not alive. What it is it's what Marx would call dead labor, but it's essentially a plagiarism machine, right? It's something that can be used to encode thousands of hours of human labor in the form of text and use it to generate a profit. Well, revenue at least. We'll talk about that later. So that's the first thing. We're not quite at Skynet yet, software, okay? So we've got a lot of internet data feeding into this software, which is then spat out. I don't know about you folks, but the internet's kind of rubbish. So there's a lot of like quite rubbish data going in. And that became clear to researchers early on. So what you have is companies, what they then did was they got a bunch of quite low-paid data workers and said, you need to check what's coming out. You need to validate this data and check it, right? And then feed that back into the model as part of human reinforcement learning. Now, I think Kenyan workers get paid about $2 an hour to do this. It's really low-paid work and really insecure. And Carlie's going to talk a lot more about this, but essentially what we have here is another input is essentially a digital sweatshop that is used to train the outputs of these models, right, and verify all this bad data that's going in. And this gets us on to our next point, that OpenAI, it's anything but open. We know roughly how the training is done, but the exact details are not made public, okay? So the obvious question is, how do we know what we're reading on ChatGPT is even true? So you have the classic problem of hallucinations, which I'm sure you're all aware of. This is where it basically is spitting out statistically likely text based on training data rather than accurate text, right? And that causes, in a lot of cases, errors or straight up like factual inaccuracies. The rates of those are quite high. As you've probably heard, enough to damage the general reliability of a lot of these things. I'm sure you've all experienced one of these. But aside from the factual inaccuracies, there's also issues with the training data going in being very biased. And researchers are talking about the issue of covert bias, covert racism, covert sexism. And what we're really doing when we're using these models is we're exposing ourselves to a very uncontrolled set of data. And an uncontrolled set of value judgments, and that's being baked into the outputs, right? So you can imagine the issues this might have if this is being used in policing, if this is being used in hiring decisions, in immigration. I see that's being done by IRCC right now, right? So you can sort of imagine some of the issues, and consider also what might happen once these companies start monetizing chatbot results, right? And you can look to what's happened with Grok AI recently to understand what that might look like, right? Famously, the chatbot that called itself Mecha Hitler. So the third problem, which Carlie's going to talk about in more detail, so I'll just mention it, is that a massive amount of data requires a massive amount of electricity and to power it, and a massive amount of water to cool the data centers, right? Calculations that the large language models need to run on is extremely energy intensive, and electricity demand from these data centers, which is the absolutely enormous buildings that they need to run these calculations to power the models. That electricity demand in the US by 2030 is expected to reach 10%, right? And bills are already going up in areas where data centers exist. So it's a big issue. What we're getting is kind of a substandard product, which is being paid for by workers. And I think on the human level, what I worry about is the more that people rely on ChatGPT or whatever it is, the more and I worry about what we're doing when we're saying a machine should be thinking for us, right? You've already probably heard about the studies of people, the cognitive debt that occurs in students when they use it to do their homework, right? And the kind of addiction to using it and not thinking for yourself. And you know, I think in such a product-driven society, it's always tempting to take the shortcut. It's always tempting to let it do the work for us. But you know, what about the revolutionary process of writing and thinking, right? I think as socialists, we know that this is a very precious process. We don't write in order to sell products. Intelligent, competent people, they write in order to think for themselves and grow their own confidence and grow their own politics as well. You know, thinking is it's just such a precious dialectical process that's developed in conversation with others. And I think the crude use of AIs robs us of this. They don't have experiential knowledge; they have distributional knowledge. It's very different, right? So clearly, there are a number of issues with AI, right? And conversely or perversely, the investment in this stuff is through the roof. Okay, so what's going on here? So AI is clearly propping up the US economy. Like, this is one explanation for why there is so much investment still going into these things despite the issues. I've written here, data centers are responsible for about 90% of all GDP growth in the first half of this year alone, right, in the US. Like, that's insane. Similar statistics with the stock market. And there's a broader conversation here about investment and how we do it, and questioning why $1 trillion has been spent on AI over the top 4 biggest companies in total, versus that being spent on anything else like public services. But the big news right now is that this is a bubble, right? We've all heard this. Bubble is forming. It's bad news. And I'm inclined to actually, believe this, and I would encourage you actually to check out the newsletter and podcast Where's Your Ed At if you're interested in the kind of business model argument of it and why the AI companies are failing. And although these newsletters have been warning about this for a while, this kind of most recent, the kind of collective acknowledgement of the bubble recently has really come out of the news from an MIT study in August that was saying that 95% of projects and businesses fail at implementation. Okay, I think we've all experienced or know someone who's experienced AI being shoved down our throats, despite us protesting about the hallucinations, that it's not useful, that we want to think for ourselves, right? Really, I think it seems like the main use of AI is kind of digital girlfriends, misinformation, and slop, okay? But the biggest problem, right? The biggest problem is that none of these companies make any money, right? NVIDIA makes a lot of money because they build the chips, but most of these companies don't make any money. And every month, the industry spends $30 billion, right? $30 billion they spend to make $1 billion in revenue. Okay, so you can see the problem, and I have no doubt a bubble is imminent, and I've no doubt that LLMs are useful to some people, right? These large language models, they can be a bit of a time saver, but what I'm saying is that the characterizations that have been used to hype up AI over the last years, it's clearly of a civilization-ending product or changing product, is that it's a big corporate oversell. It's insane levels of investment from the government and from the private sector who are locked in this arms race and that they can't back down from, right? And that's why we're seeing all of this push for everyone to use it, right? And there's also the issue of, which we don't have time to talk about, but of xenophobia, of trying to like beat China. So there's a bit of a Cold War lens to this as well, right? So clearly there's a mismatch between the promises of AI and the realities of the models today. But there's another reason why the sentiment around these models is so high, and it's this that we need to pay attention to the most, right? It's that this product is so popular with bosses, and this is true of tech generally, because it promises to deliver a society-shifting attack on labor. In the short term, it's being used to discipline labor by saying, if you don't play ball, you're going to lose your job, right? It's the fear of automation that's being used to discipline labor and scare them into lower working conditions. But in the long term, if you are able to create a digital human, what does that do to labor power? What does that do to our power to withhold our labor and make demands from our bosses, okay? So I think that's honestly why. I think due to the limitations we've been talking about, I don't think that's going to happen with large language models and ChatGPT. I do think there's a bubble, but this field will likely continue. It's not going anywhere, right? And there's new approaches to these things, making new results. You can look at quantum computing, which could potentially increase the efficiency of these calculations. There's new approaches to doing AI generally that don't involve large language models, right? So I don't think that AI as a field is going to go anywhere. And I think it's important for us to maybe adopt a framing, I think, of, aside from the LLM stuff, it's important for us to adopt a framing of AI kind of being a new frontier, but also a traditional form of automation, right? Which attack labor power and kind of lead the capitalist system itself, as this course is about, to constant crisis, okay? So as I've said, AI is a machine software. It's made up of living workers, whether that's poorly paid data annotators or the people that run the electricity system, or even us who constantly train the models by using them, right? And I think as those of you who attended the previous talk will know that this increasing investment in machines is the thing that causes the capitalist system to be prone to crisis and for the declining rate of profit. And it's not hard to see how a crisis would happen with a fully fledged AI, right? Like if half of all the jobs are lost, who's going to buy all the products, right? It really is a crisis. And I wonder if AI did get developed, would we see a similar decline in places like Toronto as other cities we saw in the 80s, like Detroit, right? And I do wonder is like, will you get that system? And I think if you take the way in which huge amounts of low-paid labor is needed to run AI models, then it's not hard to see how when a high-paid unionized job gets replaced by an LLM, what you're doing is kind of just moving that job to somewhere else in the economy. You're moving it to a poorly paid data annotator in another country, or you're moving it to a low-paid trainer in this country even, right? And in that way, it's a labor being gigafied. I think similarly, just like the selling off of public assets to private equity has led to kind of rent extraction from the real economy, AI represents a new frontier upon which that happens, because in the pursuit of profit, AI is trying to be thumbed in everywhere. I don't know if any of you heard about the new suggestion for Uber for nurses in the US, but in a system that's failing because of underfunding, they've proposed an app where nurses will essentially operate like Uber drivers taking short-term contracts in the public sector, right? So you're basically, I think throughout this process, we risk important infrastructure being sold for the benefit of big tech and the degradation of public services and the deregulation and gigification of workers. So in this way, AI and tech more generally, it has the potential to concentrate an enormous amount of power and wealth in the hands of very few tech billionaires, all the while further immiserating workers. And I would encourage you to maybe read Techno-Feudalism by Yanis Varoufakis to learn a bit more about how this might look in an end stage. But I'm at 15 minutes, so I'm going to sum up. So as I've mentioned, these large language models are having like very real effects in the world right now. I think AI's a field that's not going away, and certainly automation isn't going anywhere. So I think although it's great to point out that the shortcomings with LLMs is super important. It's kind of funny as well. We need to take the field itself seriously, and we need to take tech seriously and have a left analysis of AI going forwards, right? So it's a developing frontier, which touches a lot of low-paid workers, as well as workers that might have previously seen themselves as secure. I'm talking, well-paid middle-class professional work, for example. But, we don't want to be all doom and gloom, right? This topic is a lot of bad news, and at times it's quite infuriating to talk to people about who are real boosters of it. But people are already resisting, and they're learning lessons that set the stage for future resistance to tech and to AI. And I wonder, as a final point, might this new threat be a source of solidarity that can actually draw a wider class of people in who traditionally saw themselves as like safe from automation, safe from capitalism? But yeah, that's me. So with that, I'll pass over to Carlie.
Thanks, Josh. So let me just start by saying, even before this talk, I was kind of an AI hater. I feel like the last year and a half has just been like headline after headline about how it's sucking up all of our water, turning out AI slop, and just driving people to psychosis. But while digging deeper into how AI works, I think my disdain for AI is kind of more for boring and more precedented reasons, because ultimately this idea that's being sold to us of it being its powerful autonomous intelligence that's going to take over the world one day it's a fiction. Ultimately it's just capitalism doing what capitalism does, and it's in service of maintaining the status quo and finding better ways to exploit all of us. So in preparation for today, I just want to quickly shout out a book that really helped shape this talk. It was called Feeding the Machine, The Hidden Human Labor Powering AI. And it was written by 3 labor academics based out of the UK. A lot of the specific examples and case studies I'm going to share come directly from that book, and it's just a really well-researched tool. They spent a lot of time with workers within the AI production network, and they do a great job of breaking down both how AI affects workers and what's at stake if we don't eventually overthrow capitalism and seize the means of AI production. So what is at stake, and what harm is AI causing workers? According to Marx, and summarized by Chris Harman in Economics of the Madhouse, which was another really valuable source for building this talk, and you might have heard it referenced already if you attended the first 2 Understanding Capitalism talks. So basically Marx says that there's 3 different ways that capitalists increase the rate of exploitation. And the first way is to just increase workers' hours without proportionally increasing their pay rates. The second is just simply crude wage cuts. But the third one is the one I really want to focus on in relation to AI, because I think it's the most likely form of exploitation that's going to affect most of us directly. And that's by pressuring workers to increase their productivity. So Marx noted that once capitalists hit a wall with how much they could increase someone's working hours in a day, they turned their focus to increasing productivity, which became an obsession for big business, which I'm sure is no surprise to anyone if you've had any sort of job in your life. And so for how AI fits into this, there's striking parallels between current day AI-reliant workplaces like an Amazon warehouse and the movement for scientific management that was founded in the 1890s. This movement was founded by a man named F.W. Taylor, who believed that every industry task could be broken down into individual timed components, which could then increase the amount of work done in a day by as much as 200%. So this idea was famously successful in Henry Ford's car plants, where car manufacturers were de-skilled and forced to repeat the same monotonous tasks over and over again in the assembly line. And in other industries, productivity was also achieved by simultaneously increasing surveillance by supervisors. So to go back to the Amazon warehouse comparison, we've all heard stories about the brutal working conditions and their union busting tactics, but in order to run such a huge operation, Amazon relies on a software called SCOT, which is the Supply Chain Optimization Technologies. And this sort of acts in the background of every step along the Amazon supply chain. So it optimizes function at an enormous scale while centralizing all the knowledge and decision-making in the hands of an automated system. So the moment something's bought on Amazon, the system uses data to decide where to ship from and how to consolidate the orders most efficiently. And then it also manages the fulfillment plan using a live feed of workplace data, which has huge implications for workers, namely through de-skilling their roles and intensifying their labor in ways that mirror the previous forms of industrial control that I mentioned, like the assembly line. So workers in these warehouses are stationed in particular locations of the distribution network, and they're doing the same repetitive tasks over and over again. A worker might spend their whole shift just scanning item after item, while their manager uses AI-powered software that tracks their productivity in order to stay on target. The slowest workers are at risk of being let go, and the ones who are measured as most productive are the ones who are getting offered full-time jobs. So an example that I read in Feeding the Machine showed that if you were at the bottom 25% for a certain length of time, based on these AI-calculated performance ratings, you essentially put on probation, and if you continue to not meet your goals, you're let go. And the system tracking productivity will automatically fire employees who consistently fail to meet targets or log too much idle time. And so one of the big issues here is that the workers are being measured by the relative target, like the bottom 25%, versus a specific target, like 300 units per hour, which means that there's always going to be someone in the bottom 25%. So even if their productivity level was at the top a few months ago, that exact same rate could put you in the bottom. So this is pushing up productivity as everyone tries their hardest not to put their jobs at risk, and they never know if they're safe because they don't know the metrics that they're being measured with. And these AI management tools will just keep deriving up levels of productivity to unsustainable amounts. And so in one of the most dystopian things I read while researching was that in 2020, Amazon announced plans to employ machine learning algorithms to set workers' schedules according to muscle use and rotate their employees among jobs that use different muscle groups in order to keep them more productive. So rather than employing AI as robot workers to essentially lessen the burden for workers, it's often being used as managers and turning humans into robots while trying to squeeze as much productive labor out of them. And originally, as Josh mentioned, this sort of algorithmic management was focused on gig workers like Uber drivers or DoorDash deliverers, who have been sort of the canary in the coal mine for these sort of algorithmic management techniques for a while. But more and more we're seeing this affecting white-collar workers, especially with the pandemic causing a huge spike of people working from home, and managers started to worry about productivity. Many remote workers suddenly found themselves being monitored by software that tracks and records their work performance. And it's also increasingly used in hire and fire decisions within HR departments. So essentially, once these technologies were tested on workers with weaker bargaining power and difficulty organizing, they're now being rolled out to other sectors. And as work becomes increasingly gigified and more precarious, less and less people have access to stable full-time employment. It makes it easier to introduce these technologies. And that's, of course, why strong union and labor organizing is absolutely essential in the fight against AI exploitation. And AI isn't just affecting our working lives, it's having material impacts on our communities and our environment in general. There's been a lot of news lately about data centers, which, as Josh mentioned, are those physical locations that are required to house and process AI. According to estimates, around $3 trillion will be spent on data centers around the world between now and 2029. and which is obviously a massive amount of money. And basically what makes these different than the traditional data centers that keep the regular internet running. They've been increasing in size more generally for years, but AI has caused a huge jump in the need for processing power. So most of these models rely on expensive computer chips that are only available from a company called NVIDIA. They come in these huge cabinets that cost about $4 million each. And the chips themselves require a whole host of minerals like cobalt and gallium and lithium, which are mined across the world in environmentally destructive ways, often by exploited workers in the countries they're mined in, sometimes including the use of child labor. And in order to run ChatGPT or other LLMs, they need a network of computers running simultaneously in very close proximity to avoid latency. So this is causing huge spikes in energy usage, which is, of course, putting a lot of demand on power grids that haven't really been designed for it. And at the same time, these servers require huge amounts of water because they produce a lot of heat and they can't run if they're too cold or too hot. So the water is used to efficiently cool the systems. And these large data centers can consume up to 5 million gallons of water per day, which is the equivalent to the entire daily usage of a town with 10 to 50,000 people. So approximately 80% of that water evaporates, and then the remaining is discharged to municipal facilities, which are again unprepared for the increased volume of wastewater. So don't be surprised, there's numerous reports of low income and racialized communities being most affected. For example, I read an article in the Narwhal from earlier this month that Kevin O'Leary is planning to build a data center more than 32 times the size of the current largest data center. And of course, he's doing it on drought-stricken Treaty 8 territory without consultation from any neighboring First Nations communities. And then another important role of AI to note is its military and defense applications, which is at the core of the AI arms race. As countries are rushing to develop or get their hands on state-of-the-art AI military technologies and lethal autonomous weapon systems, the same companies rolling out other forms of AI, like management systems, LLMs that we talked about, are often linked to these defense tech contracts. So for example, after an outbreak of violence in Gaza in 2021 that lasted 11 days, Israel declared that it had conducted its first AI war. And keeping in mind this was 2 years before October 7th and the increased genocidal actions of Israel. A quote from a former IDF chief of staff claimed that rather than producing 50 targets in Gaza per year, they were able to produce 100 targets in a single day. And the PR campaign behind this AI-based targeting system can make it appear more humane, saying that it can be selected with more precision in order to reduce the indiscriminate use of force. But it was been obvious over the last 2 years of genocide that the exact opposite is true. An investigation in November 2023 revealed the existence of a program called Habsora, which produces AI-generated targets, focusing not only on military targets, but private residences. And then following October 7th, the IOF gave up pretenses of avoiding civilian casualties and began an AI-assisted bombing campaign. It was revealed that they had records of precisely how many civilians are likely to be killed in an attack and make calculated decisions about what could be publicly justified. Another system called Where's Daddy was used to confirm a target had entered their family home before being attacked, ensuring that their families were also killed as collateral damage. So AI clearly isn't saving civilian lives, it's just increasing the genocidal capacity of the IDF. And it's been proven that once tested in combat on Palestinians, the military technology is then sold and exported to conflict zones across the world. And so these military AI capabilities that are accessed by Israel are provided through Amazon and Google. They provide cloud computing services for its operations in a controversial contract called Project Nimbus. And since winning the contract, both Amazon and Google have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on new state-of-the-art data centers in Israel. And these computer vision systems needed to run things like AI targeting technology and facial recognition software need to be curated and annotated by an outsourced army of workers in the global south. So not only the military application of AI, but LLMs, surveillance software, all of that, all relies on a global production network of workers across the world. And the work itself is cloaked in secrecy, so a lot of the time the workers themselves don't know exactly what they're working on or what else is happening along the production network. And as Josh mentioned, these data annotators are the most vulnerable workforce within the AI production network. These jobs are often outsourced to the global south, where tech companies can find cheap labor, and the data work is precarious contract work with long hours in front of a screen, doing the monotonous work of training AI data sets. So for example, someone working on AI needed for a self-driving car might spend hours highlighting traffic signs or marking potential hazards in footage in order to teach the AI what to look out for and how to respond. And similar to Amazon warehouse workers, the precarity of the role forces workers to maintain their productivity. If they don't meet targets, they may have to do unpaid overtime, and their contracts are often only for a month or two of work at a time. So they're in constant fear of losing their jobs if they don't meet the harsh criteria needed for speed and accuracy. And there's a particularly large market for this type of work in East Africa, in places like Uganda and Kenya, and other countries like the Philippines and India. And despite the grueling work and low pay, because of economic precarity and high unemployment, it's still highly sought after work, and there's a lot of people who are willing to go for these jobs, which makes it difficult for workers to organize, along with the fact that these tech companies can easily pull their contracts out and move to another easily exploitable country if any sort of organizing attempts are made. So it's difficult for these workers to improve their working conditions because they don't have a lot of bargaining power and they don't have any sort of economic stability, which makes them easily exploitable. And similarly, another way that these companies are doing their data annotation is through basically crowd work or like click work, which is digital gig work platforms where people are independent contractors similar to an Uber driver, and they make about $2 an hour doing this work without any sort of employment rights or benefits. And around 30% of the work goes unpaid because requesters can just simply refuse to pay if they claim they're dissatisfied with the work. So you have the data annotators, and then you obviously have the creatives whose work's being ingested by AI, like authors and visual artists and musicians who are having their work included in these data sets that are being fed to the AI, which then AI uses to generate its own art. Similarly, voiceover artists, background actors, they're all having their likenesses and voices fed to AI in order to be regenerated without receiving anything in return. Despite protests that this is unethical and creating soulless AI slop, this doesn't matter to capitalists because they're only focused on their bottom line. And it's not just creatives whose work ends up in these data sets. This applies to academics, journalists, anyone whose work's being fed to the AI. But on the other side, a great example of how strong unions and coordinated labor actions can actually help protect workers in these situations is the double strike between SAG-AFTRA and the WGA that took place in 2023. So the Screen Actors Guild and the Writers Guild of America. And both unions won protections against AI in their collective agreements. So SAG was able to win AI disclosures for actors and set up guardrails to make sure AI can't be used by their bosses to replace them. And the WGA won a term that states studios cannot use AI to write scripts or to edit scripts that have already been written by a writer. Their contract also prevents studios from treating AI-generated content as source material, meaning if a studio were to use ChatGPT to generate a full novel, they could then use that as a loophole to pay screenwriters less as like an adapted screenplay. But the strike was able to put a clause in their contract that prevents that. So this idea of AI being sold to us by tech entrepreneurs is this idea of like an intelligent machine existing in the ether that can be used to make all of our lives easier. But the reality is there's thousands of people right now that are essential to keeping AI up and running. And although organizing in these circumstances can be extremely difficult, there's still opportunities for workers to use their collective power to strike back against these attempts to exploit and replace them. As it stands, AI is both a product of capital's constant cycle of investment and profit and an already essential tool needed to maintain its power. So knowing this, what do we do? This is a really crucial moment where the future is dependent on our current actions now, and we have to oppose this exploitation whenever the opportunity presents itself. For data annotators in the global south, this might mean uniting across borders to organize their labor so that tech companies have nowhere to turn. And for us here, it may mean standing in solidarity with those workers and putting pressure on our own employers against these forms of exploitation. And of course, a necessary component to that is strengthening our labor movements and our unions and fighting back against the increasing precarity of part-time and contracting gigafied work. So, and at the same time, if AI is as essential and capable as the tech billionaires want us to believe, which I think Josh proved might not be the case, but if it is, there's an argument to be made that these technologies should be publicly owned and used to improve our lives rather than to extract profit. And as socialists, we can imagine a better world where AI in the hands of workers actually does make all of our lives easier and lessens our grueling work hours, allows us to accelerate scientific research or help with climate solutions rather than contributing to environmental decline. For now, we have to stand with workers on the front lines who are beginning to take on these early struggles in what will inevitably be a long-haul campaign tied across labor movements, indigenous sovereignty movements, anti-war and climate movements, and so on. Because of course, the only way to achieve the future is through a global mass movement of the working class that's capable of changing the social conditions that have built the AI industry in the first place.